This panel will be talking about building a business case for security. So first I wanted to just briefly introduce our panelists. Aravind is a partner at Orrick and a global co-chair of the firm's cybersecurity and data privacy practice, and a former CHIPS prosecutor from here in Seattle. Mike Simon is the Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Technical Officer of Creation Logic, and has been working since 1993 in building security awareness and improving security posture of hundreds of companies, mostly in this area. So, welcome. And Saira is the Chief Privacy Officer at Tune. Tune is a SaaS-based platform that provides solutions for mobile and performance marketers. So, welcome to my panel. I wanted to start by giving my panelists a few minutes themselves on an intro on kind of a split question of why you believe security is important to startups and why investment in security is important up front.
Gonna make me go first?
Yes.
So thanks to the folks at the FTC for inviting us and having us here. I'm lucky to get to sit with Mike and Saira and Aaron. From our perspective, the issue with startups, and just a little bit of background. So we're a firm that grew up in the Valley, and we grew up with our clients. So our pedigree is with emerging growth technology companies, and so most of what we do is work with startups. I mean, that's a huge lion's share of what our practice is, and it's really part of our DNA. And in working with those clients, you know, we know what the life cycle is, and we know where you start and what you're thinking about being rule breakers and being unicorns and all that great stuff. And what we understand is as you go through that process, security is going to become part of your brand. It's going to become part of how you're identified in the market. And so we're working with those early stage companies to do that because it matters for them. It matters when VCs come to make their investment. It matters when they're looking at an M&A deal to actually get a liquidation event. And it matters because more and more, as you see the studies, right, trust is a huge component of brand. And I've had, and I'll just say this, which is I had a CFO of a multinational global company, which everyone will have heard of, sitting in the boardroom with the audit committee, and the audit committee's asking me about, well, what about cyber insurance and all that stuff, and the CFO said, stop. How much is the breach going to cost me? And I said, well, you know, it could cost you $100 million. And he said, that's fine. I'll write the check. The thing I can't protect is brand and reputation. That's what drives us. That's what we have spent the last 60 years developing. And for startups who are going to be known only by that brand, by your icon on a mobile app, that's a critical piece of who you are. And so building that trust early through cybersecurity and through privacy is a key component for us.
I couldn't agree more. Having been involved with probably at least 500 or 600 startups in my career, as a cybersecurity consultant, I've seen all of what you just talked about. I've seen it destroy companies. I've seen it actually put companies in a position to succeed. It's a differentiator in both directions, done poorly and done well. One of the things I promised Aaron I would do is try to embarrass him with my intro, and I'm not going to quite get there today. Nice. But I do want to. I want to talk a little bit about how I see this. And running a startup is a little bit like being chased into a very dark room full of very dangerous equipment by a velociraptor. Oh, you already know what I mean. Good, I can just move on from there. The problem is you need to move through that room as fast as you can. You need to run. And the velociraptor, of course, is the industry. It's your competition. It's those people that are out there trying to eat your lunch, or you. Audit and vulnerability testing are like a flashlight in that room. You get to shine your light over this thing and say, hey, that is not a machine I want to run into because there's big choppy things going on inside of there. A program, a security program, gives you visibility into risk that is like turning on the light switch for the room. You can't run fast in the dark, especially if there are dangerous things both behind you and around you. You can run fast if you can see where you're going. And that's the way I see developing and putting together a good security program. It's about being able to run fast. Those of you that are out there, and I know you were going to try to make this highly interactive, so I'm going to ask the first question of the audience. Sure. Raise your hand if you're part of a startup. Raise your hand if you don't realize you need to run fast. Yeah. Good, you passed the first test.
Hi, everyone. My name is Saira. I'm a Chief Privacy Officer at Tune. Just a little bit on my background and maybe how it's relevant to this discussion. I'm a recovering antitrust lawyer. Started out with the state AGs, got into privacy, worked at Microsoft, actually came to this area 10 years ago to work at Microsoft as an antitrust lawyer and got into privacy there. And I actually see someone in the audience who kind of was at Microsoft at the time, Susan, and sort of gave me my first entree into the beautiful world of privacy and data protection legislation. In any event, from Microsoft, I went to Trustee, which some of you may know. It's a pretty well-known privacy certification authority. And at Trustee, started working with startups and started realizing that a lot of the promises that startups were making, either in their privacy policies or other statements, didn't just concern end user privacy. It concerned how the company was managing data, sharing data, and securing data. And so when I think about security, it's never this sort of separate issue. It's always tied in with other issues and obligations. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who's making those representations on behalf of a company to clients, to partners, and of course to regulators. So as Chief Privacy Officer at Tune, these obligations have become very concrete for me. It's a huge part of my job is actually negotiating sort of these privacy and security addendums or sort of attachments to big contracts. And what are these? These are really embodying these requirements into a contractual obligation that we, Tune, have to other companies. So we're a SaaS-based platform, we're B2B. In many sort of instances, I feel like we're under more scrutiny than a sort of consumer-facing entity because, the companies we work with, the advertisers and marketers we work with, they are taking on liability for our practices in many cases. And we see this especially in the EU. Now, the VCs, to get to your original question, of course, security is important to a VC. Because security, to paraphrase Commissioner Brill from this morning, security is good for business, and VCs certainly know that. But I think they're looking for a lot more, and I think Mike and Aravind can speak to that. They're looking for a good data governance program, or at least the beginnings of it, because essentially, why are they investing in a business model? They want to make sure that model is scalable, but it's also sustainable, and that there is no sort of inherent regulatory risk. And so you can have risk when you don't have a good data model. You can have regulatory risk. You can face sort of contractual disputes with your clients and partners, and that's certainly no way to build market share. So I think having good security practices along with good data and privacy practices is essential for a startup to scale sustainably and also build a business model that sort of works in the long run.
That's a perfect segue. I think for this panel, we'd like to cover a few different points of view, and I think one of them is certainly the investor, the VC or the investors themselves. And before we get to the investor's point of view further, I would like to welcome anyone in the audience at any point in this panel. If you have a question, raise your hand. We're happy to field questions throughout the entire panel for this panel. So. But I wanted to kind of expand on what Saira was starting with the investor's point of view and ask Mike, kind of what is your experience working with VCs with respect to security? And what do you see from VCs when they're asking you to help out with security in any manner?
It's an interesting question. I'm glad we're getting a chance to address this in this panel. I've been advising venture capitalists, private equity firms, and just about everybody who has money laying around they want to spend in some way on this topic since the late 90s. Everybody remember the late 90s?
Only you.
Yeah, it's just me. It was a different time. Even back then, when all you had to do was give somebody $1 and they would turn it into 100 overnight, folks were asking me to help evaluate and it boils down to predictability of the organization that they're working with. Nothing is less predictable, I know that's a double negative, but go with me. Nothing is less predictable than data breach. If you have somebody accessing your systems from somewhere else, they can cause every kind of mayhem, every kind of expense, every kind of bad thing that you can imagine somebody doing on your network. So a lot of what VCs are asking about is essentially how predictable is the revenue stream and the valuation growth for this organization, and if they don't have a security program in place, it's not predictable. If you aren't careful, if you're not building a program that allows us to at least statistically know that you're protected, it's all over the map. So there are a few things that are on the obvious list. Are you if there's a regulation that you're supposed to be paying attention to, are you being compliant? If there's law involved that you should be paying attention to, and with the FTC's view of this, obviously there is, if you're doing any kind of consumer level work. You must be doing those two things. And then on top of that, again, it boils back to, have you chosen, and this one isn't obvious, have you chosen a model and not made it up yourself? I've been in the security industry for longer than some of the people in the audience have been alive. Yes, I'm old. But experience, thank you, I appreciate that.
Can raise my hand too, I guess.
But I'll tell you this, I would not presume to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and write a program for anyone, considering that there are models and frameworks out there for me to use. So those are the things they come to me with, is can we predict risk based on how well things are protected? Are there regulatory or legal concerns that we need to make sure that we've brought up to, and are they basing what they're doing on known models? And if you can answer all of those pretty positively, we'll go forward.
Yeah, so I'll add something else, which is, and Mike brings up a good point, right? I think since the 90s, right, we were sort of used to VCs working with small startups, and that was kind of their world. Because I think the concept of a startup and VCs really kind of hit its stride in that period in the 90s. What we see now is a very different dynamic, right? Because those VCs had some successes back in the 90s, and so now they're board members at giant, very mature companies, right? Where cyber risk is something that they're worried about, not just because of the monetary harm or the brand harm. They're worried that their butt's going to get sued in a shareholder derivative action, or that there's some proxy firm that's going to demand that 7 members of the board resign after there's a data security incident. So their concerns are much different, and it's shaped by the experiences that they're actually having in boardrooms that are fundamentally different, right, in terms of the concerns that they're addressing than the ones that the startups have. So it's the same board. So there's this carryover of knowledge that you're seeing, and what you're seeing is this like cross-pollination, where those board members are taking what they're learning here, and they're going to the small startups and saying, "Are you guys doing this?" And then the startup's like, "Wait, how, are you kidding? That's a $100,000 security program, or it's a $500,000, or it's a $2 million security program. We can't possibly afford to do that." And so you have this dynamic where board members are acutely aware of what the risks are for cyber in terms of brand, money, their own liability, personal liability, and the regulatory enforcement piece, right? Because that has to be, key in your mind as you're building a program, right? Is what is your compliance model, and they're bringing that intelligence to the smallest startup and asking what you're doing, and so you have to then, and I'll say this, they're going through, right? They're on the audit committee, and there's people. The cyber team is going there, the CISO is going and say, "Yeah, I have this great plan. We're going to fix everything that's wrong." Great, how long is it going to take? 3 years. And how much is it going to cost? No, about $10 million. And that's not unreasonable. And they're saying to their startups, no, do it now, because I don't want to pay for it down the road. And again, if Adam and Matthew and Peter could not convince you that you should start now, right, then we're not going to certainly do that, and the board's not going to do that. But there's real value in doing it because that solution should be scalable like everything else, right? And I just think that you have to understand that the dynamic is fundamentally different because what board members know today is so much more mature than what they knew, yesterday, 20 years ago, and it's affecting the environment. And it's a real significant carryover that we see when we're advising boards. We get, it's interesting. We spent more time in 2015 advising boards of directors about their fiduciary duties and their obligations in cyber, okay, than we did in the past 5 years that our practice has been, doing this combined. So every month we were advising a board about something that had to do with cyber. And so I think that's a shift, right? And so they are asking those questions, and they want that advice, and they want to understand what you're doing about it all.
Well, and actually, and I know you're going to want to follow up on probably some of this because we in our discussions so far, it's been important to you. In the B2B space, it's exactly what you just described, only now it's this giant business that you want to do business with. I want to sign a new contract with Amazon to provide Amazon with electrical cords or something. Well, digitally important electrical cords. You wouldn't believe what Amazon requires of my little 5-person company in terms of my security program. They're coming to me with a $10 million program that's easy for Amazon,
right,
and not so easy for me.
Yeah.
So this is what that we were gonna. Oh, we have a question. Here, can you hold on one moment so we can get it on the mic for the live stream?
We depend on you for random, Rabla.
So this is kind of random, but still pertaining to what you're talking about. So, okay, so with advising some of the, all the various different boards and that sort of thing, there's all these competing priorities and cross-cutting issues. We've got HIPAA for, healthcare information, but then all the various different states have their own individual privacy policies, or statutes, I should say. So have you guys heard anything on the front? Are we planning on passing just like a blanket federal law that will help with some of this? Because with jurisdictional prudence, and based on the type of industry you are, there's all these issues. So how are you guys dealing with that from a business case perspective, and what is the remedy for that?
So I will give Arvind 30 seconds to respond to this.
I promise I'll try to do it in 30 seconds. Forget all of that, okay? Don't plan on the federal government doing anything. They're never going to do it, okay? They're just not. And don't plan on it. Don't expect it. Don't wait for it. Don't wait for it, okay? What we tell clients, right, and this is a really good point that Mike brought up, understand what your compliance model is. Some of you have no compliance model. You are a B2C customer selling widgets on the internet, and the only person who's looking over your shoulder is the FTC and the local state regulators. And their guidance is not a framework. It's not a compliance model, right? You have in order to be sort of FTC compliant, right, you have to read every enforcement decision, which we have, right? And read them, and then you have to import them and implement them in a program. And so don't wait for that. Instead, what I would do, and what we advise our clients to do, is take the best parts of each security program and build something within a framework that makes sense for you. And the reason to do that is because there is no perfect solution for security for any company, and there's no ideal. There is what works with the limited amount of resources that you have, right? And the data that you have to protect. There's something that meets in the middle. And it's going to be one that you have to give some stuff up to get some other stuff. There are going to be sacrifices. And so you need to develop a right-sized model where the narrative about what you do is that what we did was reasonable. We hired people like Mike to come in and say, that's a reasonable security system, right, or security program. Then we hired lawyers to come in and say, that's consistent with these different pieces, right? And then you have a chief privacy officer that addresses the needs of having privacy for our consumers. There's your program, okay? So it's not relying on any one model. It's like this amalgamation that is right-sized for your company.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one
that was
thing.
way more
I
than
mean,
30
we
seconds.
do have federal privacy statutes. We don't have a comprehensive federal privacy law, but HIPAA is a privacy statute, COPPA is a Children's Online Privacy Protection Act is a statute. So yes, just echoing what Aravind said, you have to look at the data you're collecting, figure out what laws apply, build your program around that, and then, first two panels today outlined a number of resources, I think, if you're building sort of your infrastructure security. But yeah, don't wait for legislation, privacy or cybersecurity legislation, because I think it's unlikely.
So I want to pull the discussion a little bit more back into data security, if your comments can do that.
A little bit.
Okay.
So he's going to say it anyway.
Yeah, I'm just going to say it anyway. I'm just ignoring you at the end of the table. I think you should pray that the federal government not do what you just described.
Okay.
That's all I have to say on the topic.
Okay, so let's go back to so we're talking about compliance, and for many startups that may be a scary word, compliance, especially with the resources given. What are some things from if you're a startup that's business model is to do business with another business, so a B2B, what types of things can small startups do to prepare for this eventual type of business opportunity? By the way, in the way of security requirements that may come from other customers.
So certainly, and I'll start with this, and I'm sure you guys will jump in. I think one of the things that startups can expect, and this is something you should expect if you're trying to build market share but through sort of contracts and alliances with, the right clients, the right partners, you're going to expect to see some pretty extensive requirements on, they're called security questionnaires, sometimes they're called data processing addendums. They're really looking at your sort of physical, administrative, and technical safeguards for those of you familiar with, the parlance of a data governance program. So on the administrative side, they're looking at how your employees access data, whether employees use two-factor authentication. I mean, it gets that granular as to sort of the questions. And this is from a prospective client, so you, the startup, want that business. For us, for me, it's extremely important when we see one of these sort of addendums come through, and sometimes they're part of a contract and sometimes they aren't. So that's an interesting point there. If you think about contract integration, you want to, it's interesting to see which companies kind of advance these addendums as part of their contract, and sometimes they just send you a questionnaire, a standalone questionnaire. But regardless, you're making a representation to this prospective client, and you want to make sure that your representations are accurate. So for me, being a chief privacy officer, I sit in the legal department of our company. I then will need to walk down and coordinate with people in product and engineering to make sure we're doing all the things that the questionnaire says. And sometimes it revolves around security. A lot of times it revolves around access to data. And for a SaaS-based platform like us, access to data for our clients is paramount. In fact, it's what differentiates, I think, some of our products from some of our competitors' products, because clients want access to their marketing data, and they want it in real time, especially if they are running programmatic ad campaigns and they need that feedback in real time to plan additional, spends or campaigns. So with all of that in mind, a lot of the questions don't just surround, infrastructure security. They surround how you're securing your applications, employees accessing that data, but also the client's employees accessing that data. So there's a lot in there. They span a wide range of end user sort of privacy as well as contractual data and security questions. And it's sort of part of the formula. And I'll also say that none of these questionnaires and addendums follow a standard format. They're all slightly different, slightly nuanced. So they necessitate sometimes, a fresh look every single time. We've started keeping a compendium of it just for us to have as institutional knowledge. That's just, sort of a tip so that you kind of know how you answered a questionnaire in the past. That's kind of important.
So if, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
And actually, this ties in some of what you were saying, Aravind, on raise your hand if you've ever read end-to-end ISO 27002. Good job. It's a short read, super interesting, especially the middle parts. Most small companies are never going to do all of those things. And you don't want to or need to. And in fact, if you read how it's expected to be implemented, they aren't expecting that you do everything. They're expecting that you look at everything. And that's the point I want to make about some of these frameworks and how you end up responding. I've, by the way, seen 27002 in checklist form as a, are you doing these things? That's annoying. What you need to do is not just look at a framework like that and say, well, we don't need to do 90% of these things and call that good. What you need to do is take a look at these frameworks and then show that you don't need to have an SDLC. You're not developing any software, so we can just toss that whole section out. Right? And then when you get one of these questionnaires, one of these things that people are handing you to fill out and explain what your program looks like, you haven't just ignored any sort of structure. You've addressed it, and you can give them, you know, since we don't do software development, that whole section goes away, right? And that's how, as a small company, you can use these frameworks and only use those pieces that apply to you. And that's my best advice on how to approach this.
Yeah, I mean, we call those security addendums or contracts like this. We call those snowflakes because they're all a little bit different. Yeah. But the end result of a lot of snowflakes is really good coverage, right? And so what Sarah's talking about is sort of keeping a compendium of those. I mean, we've had clients who are saying, okay, look, we're gonna figure this out. And they literally sit down and they say, who are our top 20 largest business clients, enterprise clients, right? So that we're doing 10, 15, $5 million worth of business with. Let's stack those security questions end to end and figure out what Mike's describing, which is what do we need to do and what do we not need to do? But then I think this is the challenge, right? Because you're gonna have more than one customer or more than one business partner. And so you can't sit down and try to explain to each one of them in serial and articulate this philosophy that you have that you don't need to do. Somebody's gonna scream BS, okay? I'm only not swearing because we're on webcam or on video, but somebody's gonna scream BS and they're gonna say, no, we want you to do all these things. And so the other approach is to take that thought process that you're doing and articulate it, right? Put it in some kind of, call it whatever you want to call it, white paper, security guidance, whatever it is, and use that affirmatively with your clients as an advocacy piece that shows them why you don't need to do these things, and then not only tie it into the security aspect, tie it into the legal aspect, right? And do, by the way, because Sarah brought something, I have to get back to this point, make sure those are consistent with the representations that you're making with your sales force, okay? I'm gonna say that one more time. Make sure that's consistent with the representations that your sales force is making. And I don't just mean like the men and women who are out in the field selling. I mean the statements that you make on your website. I cannot tell you, okay? I cannot tell you the number of clients who are startups, who are emerging growth, who on their website say, we have bank level security, LifeLock. We have bank level security. And you get in there and can I just say, what the hell is bank level security? And I gotta tell you,
It's industry best practices.
right? Nobody knows, right? Right? Like exactly, right? Nobody knows, right? Nobody knows, and so that representation is absolutely empty. What's worse, it's probably misleading. Okay, because look, J.P. Morgan Chase just said that they spent $250 million, what, in 2015? I think they spent $500 million this year. Well, you know, we're not spending $500 million. Does that mean we don't have bank level security or we do? Can you have it without spending $500? Don't answer any of those questions, right? Come up with something that's like actually real, that's tangible. Don't just rely on these grandiose statements because they're totally empty. They're likely misleading in a lot of situations, okay? And all they can do is get you into trouble. Actually spend the time to get in the weeds, right? Let the security folks and the lawyers and the compliance folks sit down and figure out what that looks like. And then and then say, okay, I'm okay with a million different snowflakes because at the end of the day, what it's going to give me is complete coverage, right? And that's actually pretty good security.
Go ahead. Yeah, I just wanted to echo a couple points there. Of course, sort of researching what your representations say and making sure they're accurate. We all know, you know, Section 5 and prohibitions against deceptive and unfair practices. And obviously, if something that you say is not accurate and is material, then you could be looking at FTC liability. I also just wanted to add, and I don't know if you want me to talk about this now, if you're doing business in the EU, you probably have already seen something called the EU model clauses. So they're one of the ways that companies can transfer data from Europe to the US. Right now, unless you have something called a BCR, they're the only way because the safe harbor is sort of in flux. There's a proposed new, unfortunately named EU-US Privacy Shield that has yet to be okayed by regulators. That's a privacy tangent there. But I think what I'm trying to get to is that the model clauses essentially, bind your company contractually to a lot of security commitments. So you really need to research whether or not your company is doing something before putting it in a security white paper or statement, and certainly before you make a representation in a contract.
You have a question?
I'd like to ask the panel to switch sides. You provide a lot of advice to the technology vendor to enterprise clients. The enterprise clients, for their part, find that technology vendors, by and large, are very risk adverse, and there's a general perception that, notwithstanding representations about we have bank level security, they seem very unwilling contractually to really be allocated responsibility for liability. For the enterprise client, how can they really hold the vendor accountable, and what would you advise to the other side?
So,
So I wanted to
Stand back.
I want to keep this in the context of
Yeah.
advice to startups as well.
Yeah.
Couched in that in those terms.
So I think it applies to everybody, frankly, right? Because I think what you're describing, right, is the difficulties that you have, for example, in negotiating a cloud services agreement with Amazon or any one of the big players, because they're like, no, take it or leave it, okay? So two realities in doing that. One is unless you have an enormous enterprise business that you're going to bring to one of those cloud service providers, you're not going to get what you want. It's just, they're not willing. Look, in my experience, they've never been willing to negotiate. We just can't get there. And so as a startup, I would look at it differently. Okay, and as an enterprise, I'd look at it differently. I would seize upon, because, and to just make this clear, right? What you're getting from, for example, your cloud services environment flows to your customers, right? Because that's sort of what you're saying to them is, we need good security, so we've contracted with these guys. We need to make sure they have good security because it's all going to flow down to you, right? Does that make sense for everybody? That's the model that we're sort of operating under. And I think what we've done is instead say, look, we're not going to negotiate some of these things. So what we have to do is go out in the market, right, and figure out which provider actually meets the security obligations that we want, right? And then see if you can negotiate with those. So you might be looking at, smaller service providers, right, which can offer you quality services, and there's some takeaways. But they're not going to take your liability for you. So the other opportunity is to look, even as a startup, right, how do I insure that risk? Okay? Because I can't do that, and so how can I buy something that's going to back me up, right? Because I'm not going to get indemnity from them, so I'm going to need to pay for that data breach somehow, or whatever it is. And how do you buy insurance around that? And going out in the market, and we've shopped with our clients to get the right coverage. Okay, so that's one way to do it. But there's an advantage in going with those sort of big enterprise solutions, right? Even for small startups, because they can use the 27001, 27002, 27018 certifications, right? Especially with cloud, as a proxy for their own security. Now, I'm not saying that's a secure solution. That is not a security program, right? But as you're working with your customers and you're thinking about, I'm a startup, right? I can't do security, class 501. I can do security 101 internally, but I can go out in the market and buy like 301, right? And then, and there's some, and I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but think about how you buy solutions that have security built into them as part of the offering, that as a startup add value, right? It sort of answers some of those questions. And I'm not saying, again, to sort of gloss over it, right? To say that just because you bought 27018, certified cloud services that you're secure, that's not the case. But it's better than just going out and buying, some space somewhere in some, warehouse where you've never been to, you've never done a walkthrough, you've never talked to the security people, you don't know how you're going to do your forensics there, et cetera. I think that's how I would distinguish it. I'd look for those services because of the proxy value that it has.
So I guess related to the conversation about, what can startups do up front when looking at security requirements, are there any tools available that are free that a security startup can maybe start walking through in order to kind of answer these snowflake questions that may come up in security addendums or kind of prepare for those questions if they haven't yet gone after future customers?
We're all looking at each other. I think the answer is no.
There are some. Certainly there are. Sure. There are some. I mean, and you might sort of have some links. I think there were some links and resources that were discussed this morning. So, I mean, are we talking infrastructure security, or we're talking application, or something else, or just the whole framework?
Just the whole framework, maybe from an application security standpoint.
So certainly, we look at things like the OWASP 10, or we look at, in terms of how our clients or employees would access data, and then we look at sort of some of the NIST requirements. And then we also have a library of questionnaires that we've sort of compiled. So it's kind of a mix of frameworks that are out there, the requirements that we have under things like the EU model clauses. Certainly you can Google and sort of look up a standard ISO questionnaire, and you can kind of see the questions that are asked. I think the sort of standard questionnaire is about 100 questions, split a third between administrative, which is like your HR, and operations controls, technical, which includes your infrastructure and your application security, and then physical, which includes, things like a physical security plan. What happens if we have an earthquake or a shooter incident or things like that? So these are all pieces of a comprehensive data governance program. And of course, I'm coming at it from the privacy perspective. There are, some good data governance frameworks out there as well.
Better answer than mine, thank you. Yeah, there are certainly ways to approach this, and as you mentioned, there's questionnaires out there that'll walk you through some of the NIST frameworks. And as a former student of mine, you've had to deal with 853 and all of its glory. That's only 632 controls, so it's not that big of a deal. But there are ways of looking at this at a high level too. I would start with any level of examination you give your security program and your practices is better than none. So almost any tool that you use that actually answered questions like, how are we dealing with authentication and access control, with real answers, is going to actually yield some useful results for a small company. If you don't feel like getting into the weeds on something like NIST 853, just look at the highest level titles and address those titles. How are we dealing with hiring and qualification of employees? How are we dealing with access controls? And so on. If you answer those questions effectively for yourself, you're 80% of the way to having a reasonable, I think, story, as you were talking about how you've done these things. Not doing it, frankly, and this is the part that should scare you a little bit, makes you look like an idiot in front of somebody across the table who's asking those questions of you for the first time. And God forbid that would be people talking to about finance.
I would just add to, on the privacy side, there are a lot of certifications and frameworks, and there's self-reg frameworks. On the security side, we don't see as much of that. But certainly, I think, you could sort of take pieces from existing frameworks and include them. I would also add that a lot of times these questionnaires ask you for something like a SOC 2 or a penetration test. And so that's another avenue. If you have the resources, and I would highly recommend it, you can do a SOC 2 gap analysis and see where you are.
And can you explain what a SOC 2 is?
It is based on the ISO standards. And it's a pretty intensive security certification that really encompasses, probably all of those 800 some NIST controls, for a lot of startups who are looking to move fast and innovative quickly, it's not always sort of a great fit. Aravind and I have had some conversations about this, and that's also another challenge. Is there a good security certification out there that really, corresponds to the kind of innovative models that we're seeing today? And then the other option, of course, is something called a penetration test, which a lot of companies now require you to do. So that's just really kind of testing your application layer. It's not as intense as a SOC 2 certification, but that's another sort of barometer of where you are.
So this occurs to me as we're having this conversation. More in line with sort of what you said, Mike. Another thing that startup clients have done is they've hired outside security consultants to come in, and with the perspective of having done proactive assessment work for hundreds, if not thousands, of clients, and with the perspective of having responded to dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of breaches, to come in and design a security program that fits them, right? And this is the reason why. It's not because you want to go out and spend a lot of money or because you don't have the expertise in-house. You may have great expertise in-house, but there's something about attaching the brand of a security consultant to your program, saying, we had these guys come in, we kind of gave them run of the room, we let them do all the interviews and investigation they want to. This is the program they came up with. It's these guys, these guys, they're the best in the business, right? And they designed a security program for them, and we follow that. There's value in that. I mean, there is value in that. It's a much more, it's a little bit more resource intensive, but you're going to get a better fit for who you are. And if you sort of add to their plate, right, the notion of scalability in a security program over time, it's a much better maturity. It lays the groundwork for a much better maturity model.
I'd also like to add to both of those commentaries. If you remember my opening statement about a very, very dangerous room and velociraptors chasing you, I just want to get that fixed in your minds. By the way, I wish I had a slide for that. But an audit program like an SSAE 16 Type 2 SOC 2. Or any of the things that look like that, or penetration testing, vulnerability testing, security people in the room. You've been hearing folks use those interchangeably. Please be careful. Yeah, all of those things are the flashlight. They are the way to look at a thing. Even with an SSAE 16 Type 2 SOC 2, which is over a time period, that time period isn't necessarily an entire year. It is a time period which you've designated. So it is a view of that. A program, a proactively developed program that actually addresses those things on the front end is the light switch in the corner. That is the thing that is supposed to illuminate all of it and give you that visibility. And I know we have a question waiting.
Well, turned on. So several of you guys have mentioned EU data protection regulations post Safe Harbor. How are you two advising your clients, and how are you responding or advising others to deal with EU regulators, especially for new startups, given that Privacy Shield has already been rejected by half the data protection regulators, and that the model contracts are now being rejected by a bunch of German data privacy regulators? What do we have left? And is the answer just we pull out of Europe?
I love the Germans.
Yeah.
We do.
Always,
we really do.
It's always fun. Yeah.
Look, this is sort of a conversation for a different room, but I'll say this: the advice is not entirely clear yet. Okay, what I think we are saying to clients is, A, if you are Safe Harbor 1.0 compliant, right, you better be doing, or you're certified that you're compliant, you better be doing what you say you're doing. Okay, that's the first thing. If you have a program where you're using model clauses, IGA or BCRs, stay on that program for the most part, because we don't really know what Safe Harbor 2.0 is actually going to look like. For startups, look, the risk that you're going to get an EU enforcement action by a DPA is like small, like really small, like so small that you probably can't even see it. So don't worry about it. Okay, it doesn't mean don't be cognizant of those issues, because I think as Sarah pointed out, like, you have to do that data mapping and understand the process and the data flow today, because trying to do that later on is really difficult. So I'm not saying just ignore it, but I'm saying that should not be what drives your business thinking. It should be part of the program, I think, as you develop, because you want it to be scalable, you want it to grow with you over time.
Yeah, I just have a couple things to add on that. So first of all, you really, in terms of safe harbor, which is really the data transfer from the EU to the US, right? So you do care about that. You're signing model clauses with a client, even though, and I agree with Aravind, so EU regulators have never brought a safe harbor action, right? Even though they have decried the safe harbor framework and supported, Max Schrems, we don't see any safe harbor actions to date being brought by the DPAs. Of course, that might change under Safe Harbor 2.0, aka Privacy Shield. But as mentioned earlier, we're still waiting to hear whether whether the Commission and whether the European government approves that. But I will say a couple things, and I actually was at a conference yesterday where I heard a representative from the European Commission restate this and reinforce it, which is, remember, model clauses are an alternate to safe harbor. And they, both of these frameworks are under the 95 directive, which is existing EU law until 2018. So, you got to look at safe harbor separately, but model clauses is a separate independent path. And this particular official from the European Commission said, I know that DPAs have been making statements, but we are reminding them again that these are two different avenues, and certainly while safe harbor is in question, model clauses themselves and BCRs are not, because they're a separate sort of path towards that.
And I think I'm going to stop you there,
Yeah.
so that we can come back
Get security.
Get back to security. So I wanted to ask along the lines of starting a security program in terms of why it's important for your startup to do that, to invest in security. Get back to the practical questions of, what does it mean to a potential acquirer to have a security program in place and to have security by design principles in place when it comes to development of any device or application that you're working on.
Yeah, so in the M&A context, in the IPO context, every diligence project now, a couple years ago, it used to just involve privacy questions, which you kind of just checked the box and moved on. Now those privacy questions are much more robust, and now they're supplemented by a whole series of security questions, right? Developed by IT security of the company who is acquiring you, in the case of most startups. And they're really pointed. They're asking really difficult questions about what your environment looks like, and asking those questions with diligence and putting documents in a room. And the acquirer is often hiring folks, right, like Mike or other consultants, to actually read through that diligence and give a report back of what are the principal risk areas. Because the worst thing, and we've had clients do this, is buy a hole, right? Like, we do this great merger because you had a great product, and all I bought was a giant security vulnerability. And we've had clients do that. We have clients who bought a company because they wanted a product. That product happened to have a giant vulnerability in it, right, that got exploited, and now they have a breach on their hands, right? Or the company's already been breached, but they don't know it, and now you're inside, and you're like, uh-oh, now we bought a breach. So,
Yeah, I've seen all of these scenarios play out, and they are not pleasant for the person who bought a hole. And that goes back to the conversation about predictability. What an investor wants is they want to invest in a company that's going to grow, who's going to have a revenue stream that's as expected, and doesn't suddenly have a $100 million lawsuit against them. They really don't appreciate those. But to get back to the question you're asking as well, there's a really interesting, I think, different view of why to do security and why to do it well. A gentleman by the name of Gene Kim, pretty well known in ITIL circles. Gene Kim did a survey of 1,500 different IT organizations, and forgive me, I'm going to read a little bit here from my notes to get this right, a while back. And one of the things he found is that high-performing IT organizations that have actually done IT and IT security properly are 4 times more productive. That in fact, by putting processes in place, now this part doesn't sound like magic at all. By putting processes in place, things like change control, that's an important part of any security program. you become more efficient. You're better at doing those things that manage information properly. 4 times more effective. And so one of the things that fell out of this too was 60% of that greater effectiveness was embodied in just 3 controls. Hopefully I have those 3 controls in front of me. Standardized configuration strategies, basically knowing what it is you have out there. And if you look at the SANS top 20 list of things that you should be doing, what are numbers 1 and 2? Number 1, know what you have. Number 2, know what's running on what you have. Those are both embodied actually in standardized configuration strategy, having this ability to roll out just things that you know exactly how they're configured. 2, process discipline. That's another way of just saying we have from the highest level of the organization through the organization, we're interested in process and making sure that those processes operate in the ways that we expect them to. And the last one, and this one shouldn't come as a particular surprise, controlled access to production systems. When you're talking about production, those things that actually operate your business, making sure that only those people with the need and requirement for accessing it are getting that access, and that in fact it's very well controlled. If you implement a program that just does these things, you're not going to pass any level of audit from anybody. Nobody's going to say, wow, that's an amazing program. But oddly enough, you get 60% of that 4x improvement in productivity. By itself, I think that's a reason to actually implement these things that we're talking about.
We have a question.
Thoughts on social engineering? We hear a lot, go through the checklist, make sure all of your assets are defined and you know where things are at, but I haven't heard anyone mention the people that are behind the computers and how fallible they are. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it is a
First of all, Mike, could you define social engineering? And then if you could, and then feel free to, and if you're free to answer.
You raise an excellent point. To just give everybody who hasn't heard about this a view, social engineering is essentially managing the manipulation of individuals or groups to perform actions that compromise information assurance. So the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information compromised by human action as influenced by a third party. What do I mean by that? I mean, the last 5 or 6 serious breaches I've seen were accomplished by calling somebody and saying, hi, this is so-and-so, I'm really an employee, give me credentials. And it works. Back when I used to do vulnerability testing and penetration testing, I would always refuse to do social engineering tests because I knew the outcome. Always. I've never failed. If you're any good at it, you don't ever fail. So the assumption in this is you need to educate those folks. You need to take special care trying to show them what kinds of things are happening in this field, and that human beings absolutely are a part of any program. It's not just about the technology. It is about, I think, number 2, process discipline in a lot of cases.
Yeah, one of the questions that you will see on those questionnaires is, do you have a security awareness program? And that is literally a training program to address social engineering. And, just a couple thoughts. At Tune, I actually do an onboarding with all new employees. I explain to them the differences between privacy, data, and security, because those 3 concepts are conflated. And then I sort of help, empower them to sort of have good security practices themselves on behalf of the company. So that's everything from two-factor to accepting a LinkedIn request from someone that you really don't know. We actually just finished filming an internal security awareness training, and it was fun. We did it all by video. We got, various folks in the company to do different parts of it. So, someone did sort of email process. We had a little skit to illustrate social engineering. But training is key, and you can find new and inventive ways to do it, but kind of getting your employees involved and to quote the first panel, building that security culture, I think, is an essential part of addressing social engineering.
Except that, just the reality, I think, though, is you can train and train and train and train and train, but where the statistics show that the speed with which people click an email, and lawyers are the worst at this, right? It's like 3 seconds, right? Most people who click on a phishing email have clicked on 3 seconds. So you can train all you want, and until it becomes sort of like part of their DNA, because it's part of your corporate culture, right? Security is part of your, it's something that's valued. It's almost impossible. Yep. And so I think you need to start to think about other things, because like the biggest vulnerability is always going to be that mess that sits in between the chair and the computer, right? It's just always going to be, right? It's always going to be that like.
Most incidents start with employees.
Yeah, I mean, 97% of all breaches start with phishing, or have some element of phishing associated with them. 97%, right? So it leaves a very small number that are not. And so you can. So I'm a big fan of training. And do it all you want, do it regularly. But even the FBI in Portland did a phishing test a couple years back, and they have like 35 people or something in that office, right? And they did a phishing, they sent something, and 7 people clicked on it, right? By the way, 7 were all managers, right? They're all like SACs, right? They're all like supervisory agents in charge, right? Or lawyers, right? But that's who's clicking on that stuff, right? And I'll just share this because this is a hilarious story, and it's great. We did a phishing test with a client where we offered a free iPad if all you had to do was enter your birth date, social security number, and HR would get your information, and they'd send you an iPad, or they'd enter you to win a free iPad. And so and we did all keystroke logging to actually track and watch it. And there was a C-suite level individual who got to the computer, saw the email, clicked on the link, brought them up to a fake web page, started to enter the name, started to enter his social security, and got to like the 5th digit, and then said, and then hit backspace, and then picked up the phone and called HR and said, I gotta tell you, I'm really not an iPad guy. Do you guys have like a Google tablet of some kind? Right? And so it's just like, the reality is like, we can watch you get that close. And I just think, you have to develop, your information program has to accommodate and address the reality that people are going to be your weakness.
Yep. It's successful 100% of the time.
Right.
I've never seen a social engineering test fail.
Yeah.
And with that, I'd like to give a few more minutes to open it up for questions, if you have any questions. Security-related questions.
No privacy allowed.
So you guys were just touching on this, but on the insider, right? The insider threat, insider risk management. What do you have to say for companies to address that?
So it's a really, really good question, especially for startups where IP is such a critical asset value, and where it's really easy to just pilfer it and go run and start your own company. Look, you have to start that from a careful vetting process with a clear set of policies and procedures and an onboarding employment process. And I really think that's an area where you can really get a lot of value from employment lawyers who've done a lot of trade secret litigation, frankly. Because they've seen how all of these weird stories all fall out. And you really need to think about, like, how are you going to use the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, right? I'm not going to just create policies that limit where you can go in my environment. I'm actually going to create walls that you actually have to breach to get that data. And I'm going to think really carefully about policy of least privilege, right? And what we do in terms of identity access management, where you can get access to in the server and where you can't. The CEO never needs the HR database. Never. Never, 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 right? Somebody else is going to be doing that. So don't give her access to that system, okay? Vice versa, HR never needs to see the finance, right? They never need to get into SAP to do the financial stuff. So leave him in HR off that list. And so it's creating like a sort of comprehensive thing. But think about, I guess Adam said this, right? Think about how crap goes wrong, right? And then build your policies that way. Think about what you've seen in your own environment, in your own industry, right? About how people have stolen technology and stolen IP, and then address it that way, right? Because you know your people, you know what people are likely to do in your environment, and so we construct it sort of outside in. And it really is just a matter of having, and then have policies built in so that when you need to get access to someone's computer, right, you have whatever it is, your banner, your information security policy that they had to sign that says, you have absolutely no freaking expectation of privacy in this computer and any other computer that you may ever use to access our system. Full stop. Sign here, certify, picture taken, fingerprint, right?
They've used the word.
Said from a
Yes.
former CHIPS prosecutor.
Right? But that's a key thing to do.
But I wanted to thank my panel, and we'll end at that. And so thank you, Arvind, Mike, and Saira. And I hope for the startups here and the small businesses here, I think that the numbers that Mike certainly provide a good sense of building the business case for security just from purely a performance standpoint, as well as our discussions about investors and potential customers. So thank you.